Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. I'm Dr. Zainab Farhan, a research associate at IGHD, and your MC for today. Welcome to the IGHD Annual Conference 2025, organized by the Institute for Global Health and Development at the Aga Khan University in collaboration with SDSN Pakistan. This year's conference brings together leading voices in global health, climate science, architecture, and sustainable development, united by one shared objective: how to build climate-resilient environments for vulnerable communities in Pakistan and beyond. We will now begin with a recitation from the Holy Quran. Could I please have Abdullah Babar take the stage?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful, and the beneficent, has taught the Quran, He has created man, He has taught him speech, the sun and the moon adhere to a schedule, and the stars and the trees prostrate to him. And the heaven He raised high, and He has set the balance, that you do not transgress with the balance, and establish the weight with justice, and do not make deficient the balance. And the earth He has laid out for the creatures. Therein are fruits and palm trees with shaded fruit, and the corn with husk and grain. So, which of the favors of your Lord would you deny? Sadaqallahu al-Azim.
Thank you, Abdullah. That was wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Zulfikar Ahmed Bhutta, Distinguished University Professor and Founding Director of IGHD at the Aga Khan University. Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta is the founding director of both the Institute of Global Health and Development and the Center of Excellence in Women and Child Health at AKU. Internationally, he serves as the Robert Harding Inaugural Chair in Global Child Health at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto and co-director of the Sick Kids Center for Global Child Health, widely regarded as one of the world's foremost authorities in global health. He has shaped international policy through pioneering work in maternal, newborn, and child health nutrition and health system strengthening. His contributions have earned him global recognition, including the 2025 Virchow Prize for Global Health, the International Pediatric Association Lifetime Achievement Award, the Nils Rosen von Rosentin Medal, one of the highest honors in pediatrics, and induction as a Distinguished Fellow of the American Society for Nutrition. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Zulfikar Bhutta to deliver the welcome address and introduce His Excellency Tariq Ali Khan. A round of applause, please.
Very much for that generous and kind introduction. It sometimes becomes difficult to recognize yourself in terms of the accolades that you present and exaggerate on. So, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you all here today. And before I say a few words, and the Honorable President of Aga Khan University welcomes you formally with his own thoughts on the subject, I'd like to take an opportunity to thank the Honorable High Commissioner for Canada to Pakistan. We're very honored, Excellency, that you spare time within a few weeks of your arrival in Pakistan to visit us at Aga Khan University. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce the High Commissioner to you so that we don't have to do it again and you know who he is. So, His Excellency holds a BA in English from the University of Toronto and a Master's in International Rural Development Planning from the University of Guelph in our neighborhoods in Toronto. And his distinguished career in the fields that he now serves in have been through Canadian Heritage in 1999 and is joining the CEDA, now part of Global Affairs Canada, in 2005. And he's held senior leadership positions as Director of Democratic Institutions and Conflict, very relevant to our geographies, Director of Development in Haiti, Pan-African Affairs, West and Central Africa, and Central America and the Caribbean. And in addition, he has served in China, Colombia, and most recently as the head of the Canadian mission in Jordan. A whirlwind tour of the world and a career diplomat, so we're very honored that you're here, and we look forward to hearing from you a little later in the program. Ladies and gentlemen, we were expecting our Honorable Minister of Planning to join us in person, and unfortunately he has been asked by the Prime Minister to stay in Islamabad to head 2 committee meetings, something that my friend Wontanak from Cambodia, the Rector of University of Health Sciences, is well aware of, because he also has to go back to attend to a ministerial request. So politicians and certainly political leaders live this kind of a tightrope of last-minute adjustments. But we will have the benefit of having the Honorable Minister join us virtually, I hope at around 5:30. So why are we holding this conference? The Institute for Global Health and Development at Aga Khan University was largely set up about 3 years ago to create a platform across university academic programs for scholarship where we could bring a diverse set of players, scholars, students, and experts together periodically to discuss issues related to a variety of global priorities, including the Sustainable Development Goals, but specifically with a focus on climate change, environment, health, and development. And we have done this through a series of activities over the last few years, which have been greatly assisted by a leadership council that we appointed with hand-picked individuals who represent the who's who of the field in Pakistan. And I'm very grateful to many of them who are part of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network Leadership Council, who are here today amongst us. Ali Tohir Sheikh, Dr. Nasir Mehman, Dr. Durrani, and many other individuals who've been part of that journey. We focused on the more difficult issues, the so-called wicked problems of climate change, health, environmental issues, in not just regular, but in polycrisis settings. And Pakistan is, as many of you know, at the epicenter of these issues, ranking amongst the top 10 most affected or vulnerable countries, even though we have contributed very little to global greenhouse gas emissions. But we cannot forever ask the world to give us resources, funds, or pay for what we are paying for in this country. As is very evident now, in the global climate change scenario, as you may have realized from the recent failure of getting resources into climate change in COP30 in Belém in Brazil, many low and middle income countries are on their own. And they largely have to invest themselves through their own domestic resources, at times through strategic partnerships with countries that are still investing in climate and environment, to help build resilience, adaptation, and to do things with the limited resources that we have. So at the Institute for Global Health and Development, we have really focused on the key issues of climate challenges in Pakistan, be those extreme heat events, particularly urban heat islands that affect megacities, erratic monsoon patterns that have led to water insecurity. We were talking today, because we have launched a book on this recently, looking at glacial melting and particularly its impact on populations in our vulnerable northern areas of the country. And also the interface of climate change and air pollution. Very poorly recognized, and certainly a source of great consternation for civic society in many parts of the country, which between now and January will be impacted by that enormously. So we picked up some of those issues from the lens of not just doing a diagnostic, but focusing on what can be done. Tangible solutions within means and resources. So we all recognize the challenges that we face, and as I've often told my own students, climate change's impacts, direct and indirect, are always exacerbated by pre-existing conditions, and particularly pre-existing social disparities, inequities, and challenges. So if you already have things like gender disparities, climate change exacerbates it. If you have populations that are living in marginalized, vulnerable situations with fragile health systems, you can be assured that climate change will make that worse. So certainly addressing some of those issues with those who are affected most is extremely important. And in our setting in Pakistan, some of the most affected populations are the urban poor, because they do not have the elbow room to adapt and to change. Some of the most affected populations are those who live in rural areas, where deforestation at times by groups and individuals and mafias is beyond the control of local populations. And also those who are impacted by the fact that they have no alternative but to live in the floodplains and grow their crops in the floodplains because they have nothing else. And those are the real challenges that we need to look at. And this particular conference, sirs, ladies and gentlemen, is focused on looking at solutions which require infrastructure change. And that's why a large proportion of our participants today are engineers, architects, planners, and also people who come from the social sciences. And I'm very grateful to the various individuals who have made their way today to join us for the next two days. There are solutions, and just as I conclude, if we did not believe that there were solutions, we would not invest in this effort the way that we do. And what are the solutions that are potentially possible, ranging from the highest level of policy and policy integration to the creation of early warning systems that would allow civic society to respond at a level of granularity that can make a difference to both the farmers and laborers and workers, to community-based adaptation and resilience, areas that we are very actively engaged in rural Pakistan, is to see how the communities can, through a self-help process and through a process of engagement with technical expertise, make their lives and livelihoods better. And most importantly, how do we create this cross-sectoral collaboration? So I am very pleased that there are members from our Civil Services Academy who are here. Welcome, sirs, that you are here. You're at that stage in your own careers where what you will take from here will probably help you throughout your lifetime. And you are going to be the backbone of civil service administration. And hopefully some of the policies that you may be able to implement in your geographies will make a difference. So without further ado, let me now pass the floor back to the MC to introduce our Honorable President and for him to make his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bhutta. It is now my honor to introduce Dr. Suleiman Shahabuddin, President of the Aga Khan University. Dr. Shahabuddin is the Chief Executive of AKU's global academic and healthcare system, spanning South and Central Asia and East Africa. Under his leadership, AKU has expanded its research footprint, strengthened its commitment to climate and environmental resilience, and advanced health system innovations, including the establishment of the Arusha Climate and Environment Research Center in Tanzania. Earlier this year, he was awarded Sitara-e-Imtiaz for his contributions to health and education in Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Suleiman Shahabuddin to deliver the welcome remarks and read a special message. Hold your applause, please. Please welcome Dr. Sulaiman Shahabuddin to deliver the welcome remarks and read a very special message from the Chancellor of the Aga Khan University, His Highness the Aga Khan V. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for those generous remarks. I wish my wife was here to listen to these. But let me start by Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Let me recognize our chief guest. I'm not sure if he's online as yet or not, Zulfi. Professor Hassan Iqbal, the Federal Minister for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives. Our special guest, His Excellency Tariq Khan, High Commissioner of Canada to Pakistan. It's a pleasure, sir, to welcome you. And I echo Zulfi's remarks that you have just taken on this new responsibility. So it's really, I mean, we are very grateful for you making the time to visit us at AKU today. We have our provost, Dr. Tanya Bubela. Thank you very much, Tanya. I see Dr. Paul Dalla as well. And Paul is the vice chair of the Aga Khan Development Network's Environment and Climate Change Committee. So an important figure when we talk of AKDN and its climate programs. Thank you, Paul, for traveling all the way from Vancouver or Geneva or wherever you have come from. China, okay, fine, China. To all the panelists, speakers, and participants, our AKU colleagues, our Aga Khan Development Network colleagues, a very good afternoon and welcome to all of you. So today, actually, my job is very simple, and it is to read. Normally, I don't like reading, but this is pleasant because this is a message from our Chancellor, His Highness the Aga Khan. And you know, he is very passionate about climate change and environment sustainability. He has been talking about this for long before people started talking about it. So I'm very grateful to him. All of us are grateful to him for his graciousness in sending us this message. But just before I do that, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us today to consider and to participate in this very important discussion and this very important challenge facing Pakistan and many countries like Pakistan. And this is really keeping our population safe, keeping our population healthy amid climate change. So when we talk about making the built environment resilient, ultimately, eventually, we are talking about protecting people. We're talking of protecting people from floods, and we in Pakistan know how devastating the floods of 2022 were. We know the recent floods, we know the heat waves, the droughts that happen, and all their wide-ranging consequences. And that's the goal for all of us to share today. That's what links all the presentation and discussions that this group will have today and tomorrow, whether the subject is decarbonization, it is rising sea levels, melting glaciers, or the healthcare system. And you know, AKDN runs a pretty large healthcare system across countries. We see about 14 million patients a year. And if healthcare were to be classified as a country, all the healthcare systems, it would be the fifth largest emitter of emissions, the fifth largest emitter. So healthcare, and we are in the healthcare space, and it's interesting because on the one hand, we are the largest emitter, but we are also supposed to provide treatment and care to patients and to others who get affected by climate change. So it's really an important subject discussion that we will have over the next couple of days. So as you know, my AKU Aga Khan University and Aga Khan Development Network colleagues know very well that protecting Pakistan and protecting other countries from the ravages of climate change, as I mentioned, is one of the foremost priorities of His Highness the Aga Khan. And he never misses an opportunity to talk about climate change and our role and what we can do to protect our climate. As Chancellor of the Aga Khan University and Chair of the Aga Khan Development Network, His Highness has guided the AKDN agencies to achieve net zero by 2030, a very challenging task. And every time I go in front of him and this topic comes up, I look here and there because I know how difficult it is to achieve net zero by 2030. But His Highness, his guidance, his support, and he is committed to assisting the AKDN institution and helping the most disadvantaged to thrive amid climate change through research, education, advocacy, partnership, and knowledge sharing. So with those few remarks, thank you again for coming. Allow me now to read the message from our Chancellor, His Highness the Aga Khan. Professor Ahsan Iqbal, Federal Minister for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives and Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission of Pakistan, Mr. Musaddiq Masood Malik, Federal Minister for Climate Change and Environment Coordination, President Sulaiman Shahabuddin, distinguished guests. The challenges you are discussing at this symposium on climate change and the built environment are urgent and universal. Around the world, we see how climate change threatens lives, livelihoods, and the very foundations of human development. This gathering, led by Aga Khan University's Institute for Global Health and Development, is significant not only for its subject, but also for the diverse expertise it has brought together. Public health professionals, engineers, architects, policymakers, climate scientists, and development practitioners. Your combined knowledge and commitment can help us understand the scale of the challenge and identify practical solutions of critical importance to low and middle income countries. You meet at a time when Pakistan has once again endured devastating floods, exposing the vulnerabilities of mountain communities, downstream cities, and rural populations. Such events remind us that extreme weather may be the trigger, but it is human choices that determine the magnitude of loss. Encroachments on waterways, weak land use planning, inadequate building standards, use of inappropriate construction materials, and chronic underinvestment in essential infrastructure have magnified the risks. Climate change is one of the greatest threat multipliers of our era. It impacts intensified disease, malnutrition, displacement, learning loss, and poverty. These burdens fall disproportionately upon women, children, older adults, and marginalized societies. Addressing them is not optional. It is imperative for equity, stability, and sustainable development. A central theme of this symposium is that resilience must begin where people live, learn, and work. Homes, schools, health centers, streets, and drainage systems must be designed with climate resilience in mind. Even modest low-cost measures such as enforcing setbacks, using nature-based solutions, using low-carbon building materials, undertaking energy audits, and adhering to green building guidelines and construction standards can have transformative effects. Nowhere is climate change more urgent than in the health sector. Climate-ready facilities, cool cities, reliable green energy and water supplies, as well as safe cold chains are all essential for continuity of care. Locating facilities on safe ground can ensure they remain functional during shocks and be able to serve as platforms for early warning and community risk communication. But infrastructure is not enough. Effective governance is equally critical. Recent debates in Pakistan's National Assembly highlighted that many of the losses suffered in recent years were preventable. Stronger norms, standards, and enforcement must be at the heart of effort to protect societies. This symposium also highlights the importance of investing in people and knowledge. We see many opportunities for the Aga Khan University and the University of Central Asia to contribute to education, research, and capacity building together with their partners around the world. I'm pleased that many of our collaborators from across Pakistan, Europe, North America, and Southeast Asia are present today. Progress in addressing climate change will depend on partnership. It will depend on collaboration among governments, communities, universities, professional bodies, and the private sector. Material sciences and energy-efficient construction methods must all play a role. Above all, solutions must be cost-effective and inclusive. Vulnerable societies often hold practical knowledge of sustainable solutions. We must make sure to learn from them and with them. The issues before us are immense, but through scientific discourse, research, and partnership, we can shape a future in which our built environment strengthens resilience and reduces vulnerability. May this symposium be a step toward that future. Thank you, Aga Khan. So with that message, allow me to take my speech, to take my seat. Thank you again to all of you coming, and welcome. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for the Honorable Minister Ehsan Iqbal to join us. If you could just wait shortly, please. Thank you.
Could we have the Honorable Minister on the screen, if we can? Can you hear us? So I'll proceed with my very important task of introducing our Honorable Minister, who could not be with us today in person. But I've known Minister Ehsan Iqbal for over almost 2 decades, and I will introduce him, and I hope that he can hear us today. Minister Saab, can you hear us, sir?
I can hear you.
Well, fine. Sir, thank you very much. We've just had the message from His Highness the Aga Khan V, read by the Honorable President of the Aga Khan University. So I will introduce you, sir, and then we would like to hear your views as you inaugurate this particular conference. So Professor Ehsan Iqbal is the Federal Minister for Planning, Development and Special Initiatives and the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, one of the highest positions in the country, responsible for its development. He's one of Pakistan's foremost leaders in long-term national planning and inclusive development. He was the architect of Vision 2010, Vision 2025, and he's overseen major reforms in governance, infrastructure, energy, economic transformation, and sustainable development in Pakistan. He's been a strong advocate for youth empowerment, social cohesion, and evidence-based policy making, and he's been recognized internationally as a champion for the SDGs, CPEC champion, productivity leader, and he continues to represent Pakistan's development priorities in global platforms. I have had the personal pleasure of knowing, sir, your interest and your contributions to improving food security and nutrition in Pakistan. And I know that your initiatives have also spearheaded some very strong initiatives for the future, Parwas Pakistan. And we'd like to hear a little bit from you in terms of what we need to do for climate adaptation resilience, particularly when it comes from the urban architecture and infrastructure perspective. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us virtually, and I'll pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zulfikar Saab. It is indeed a great pleasure and honor for me to join you today online. All the distinguished guests, faculty members, development partners, and Aga Khan University students. I really wanted to be there personally, but because Prime Minister is out of country and I was assigned few assignments, so I had to stay back. Otherwise, I came back from Gilgit this morning to take 2 o'clock flight to be there with you for this conference physically. But unfortunately, I could not make it. But thanks to the technology that I'm honored to join you today for a conference that addresses one of the most urgent challenges of our time, how to make and build our environment resilient in cities in a rapidly changing climate. This discussion could not be more timely for Pakistan, as we have seen two major floodings, one in 2022 and other in 2025. And these floods have shown that climate change is no longer an environmental issue alone. It is a development issue, a public health issue, an economic survival issue, and most critically, a built environment issue. Under Prime Minister's Udan Pakistan National Transformation Framework, we are reorienting our development model to make resilience, sustainability, and climate adaptation fundamental pillars of Pakistan's economic takeoff. This conference strengthens that mission. As I said, that the two floods have destroyed schools, homes, health facilities, roads, and essential services. They wiped out infrastructure that took decades to build, especially in low-income and informal settlements. And unfortunately, the worst part of 2022 super floods was that those floods hit the poorest areas of Pakistan, in Balochistan and in Sindh. We now understand clearly climate change destroys the foundations upon which economies grow. So therefore, Udan Pakistan recognizes this threat and integrates resilience at the heart of its 5 pillars. The export pillar focuses on climate-smart agriculture, industry, and green trade. E-Pakistan focuses on smart systems, climate data, early warning technologies. Energy and infrastructure pillar focuses on green infrastructure, efficient water systems, climate-proof planning, and building adaptation into our infrastructure. Equity and empowerment pillar focuses on protecting the poor and vulnerable and building community resilience in our communities, particularly the poor communities, because all the calamities they hurt or hit poorest segments and children and women the most. Climate resilience is not a side agenda, it is now a national survival strategy for Pakistan. So Pakistan cannot afford another year of climate disaster. We need a decisive shift from typical construction to climate smart, low carbon, equitable, and affordable development. So therefore, we have prioritized under Udan Pakistan 4 strategic adaptation actions. 1, climate resilient housing for low income families. Under the equity and empowerment pillar, we are developing a national climate resilient housing program focused on elevated plinth designs for flood prone regions, heat resilient building materials, low cost shelters using indigenous techniques, and housing microfinance and climate insurance for poor families. This is not charity, this is climate justice, but unfortunately, globally, this is not recognized still as climate justice, and despite all the promises that have been made, international community has not been able to come forward with any meaningful contribution. And as I always say, that we are used to hearing from global north in the past to do more. I think now from global south, we can say to global north, it's time for them to do more. Number 2, climate smart infrastructure under energy and infrastructure pillar. Our Udan Pakistan mandates that all public infrastructure, schools, hospitals, BHUs, water systems, local roads must follow climate stress tested design standards. And the 3 actions are underway: Green Building Code for Pakistan based on global best practices, climate proofing of all federal PSDP projects through Planning Commission guidelines, and a national shift towards solar, wind, and hybrid renewable energy to reduce pressure on the poor and make infrastructure affordable. A healthy facility that collapses during floods or fails during heat waves is not development, it is sheer negligence. Udan, Pakistan is correcting this. 3, urban resilience framework for our major cities, particularly Karachi. One of the challenges we have is that now urban planning is purely a provincial subject, but from the federal government, we can work in collaboration with the provinces, and that is why we have set up an urban planning unit at Planning Commission to work in partnership with the provinces for faster and speedier adaptation and building resilience. Karachi is the front line of climate vulnerability. Under Udan's energy infrastructure and environment pillars, we are supporting Karachi urban drainage and flood mitigation plans, restoration of coastal mangroves as natural defense walls, heat wave action plans for informal settlements, green and blue corridor redevelopment, waste to energy partnerships, smart city tools for monitoring water, heat, air, and flooding. Karachi is Pakistan's economic engine, and its resilience is national resilience. 4, digital climate solutions under the Pakistan pillar. To democratize climate resilience, every citizen must have access to simple digital tools regardless of income. So therefore, we are focusing on Udan early warning SMS systems through NDMA and other climate disaster-related agencies, heat health advisory alerts, mobile-based flood forecasting, local languages, digital city dashboards for disaster response, and AI-based risk mapping for informal settlements. Technology is the bridge between awareness and survival, especially for the poor. And I hope that Aga Khan University, which is one of our leading universities, with its help, we can promote academia and government partnership for having more evidence-based, research-based, and data-based interventions. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me say in the end that we also hold many solutions in our traditional architecture. Pakistan's architectural heritage offers wisdom perfectly suited for our climate. Courtyards that ventilate naturally, thick mud walls that insulate, shaded verandas that cool without electricity. These are climate-smart designs embedded in our history, which we are foregoing or leaving at very fast speed. So we need to also find solutions from our own heritage and tradition. For low-income communities, these indigenous techniques can offer affordable, resilient, and sustainable alternatives to energy-intensive construction. Sometimes the most advanced solutions are the ones our ancestors perfected. So the future is hybrid, blending local wisdom with modern innovation. The most effective path forward is to combine what we know with what we are discovering through innovation and new technologies. Hybrid buildings using local materials, efficient insulation, renewable energy, and climate-responsive orientation can significantly reduce energy demand and strengthen resilience. This approach works in cities, in rural areas, and in public facilities. It allows us to build smarter, build stronger, and build sustainably. In Gilgit-Baltistan, in riverine belts, and in glacial melt zones, climate change is reshaping daily life. I just returned from there this morning. Elevated homes, naturally ventilated community spaces, flood-resistant materials, and locally sourced construction can make the difference between loss and safety. This is why projects like the recently approved Rural Development and Climate resilience project in Gilgit-Baltistan worth rupees 16.2 billion are important interventions. It brings together sustainable tourism policies, land zoning, energy efficient housing, sanitation improvements, and renewable energy systems, including microhydel. It shows how development and climate resilience can be delivered together, not separately. In hospitals and clinics, if hospitals and clinics fail during a heat wave or flood, entire communities are left vulnerable. So therefore, we are supporting to retrofit and design health facilities that stay operational under extreme conditions using passive cooling, improved ventilation, green landscaping, and resilient utility systems. A climate resilient health system is essential for climate resilient Pakistan. So, ladies and gentlemen, for the future, sustainable development is no longer simply about growth. It is about protection, preparedness, and long-term resilience. Every building, every street, every public space must be planned with climate realities at its core. And therefore, in federal government, now we have made it mandatory that every future project must pass this litmus test of its readiness to be climate resilient. This conference plays a vital role in that journey. It brings together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and communities to chart a path towards a safer and more resilient and inclusive Pakistan. I thank Aga Khan University for convening this timely dialogue, and I assure you that the government of Pakistan, particularly the Ministry of Planning and Development, is committed to embedding resilience into every dimension of development, and I shall be very keenly looking forward to the recommendations of this conference, and I can assure you that all the recommendations we receive, they will not be dispatched to the library or to the bookshelves. We will do our utmost to implement the recommendations of your conference because, as I said, it is not just about future, it is about our today. It is not about preparing to meet a disaster, it is about protecting our development from climate disasters in order to make sure that our people continue to march on their path of development. So in the end, I thank you all and once again apologize for not being there and would again repeat that I would love to see actionable, doable recommendations which will come out of this conference, and we will be more informed, and we are strongly committed to implement all the ideas that will come from this conference. Pakistan, Zindabad.
Thank you very much, Professor Hassan Iqbal. I know how busy you are, busy you were, and I'm personally extremely grateful to you for making the time, despite all these commitments, to speak to us. I can assure you, sir, we will share the proceedings and their recommendations with you, and also send you the proceedings of our previous conferences on water and water security in Pakistan. Thank you very much once again. Thank you for joining us from Islamabad.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce our first keynote speaker for this evening, Professor Sajida Heather Vandal. Professor Vandal is an eminent architect, educator, and cultural heritage specialist. She is the former principal of the National College of Arts, Lahore, and former vice-chancellor of the Institute for Art and Culture. She currently serves as CEO of the Trust for History, Art, and Architecture of Pakistan, TAP. Over her distinguished career, she has led numerous heritage conservation initiatives with UNESCO, ICOMOS, and national bodies across Pakistan. In recognition of her contributions to culture and arts, The government of France awarded her the prestigious title of, and please forgive my French, Dr. Vandal, the Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et Lettres. Her keynote address is titled, Blending Climate Resilience and Traditional Architecture in Pakistan. Ladies and gentlemen, a warm round of applause for Dr. Vandal, Professor Vandal.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And let me say that how, happy I am to be in this forum where such a diverse group of professionals have been brought together, because we usually live in our little worlds, and this is now an opportunity for us to look across and share knowledge between us. So in my presentation, I'm just going to talk about some of the things that I have experienced through the projects that we've done and the various kind of activities we've been involved with. And I'm just going to share that. So where do we start? Which one is this? Thank you. So these are familiar pictures for us. Unfortunately, they're happening just too often now. The first ones, which we tend to now keep in our hearts and our minds, are the disaster of 2005, which was the earthquake. And perhaps it was also as a result of some of the ways that we have treated the earth by deforestation and all. And then you see the later two major disasters which have occurred, which a lot of people have already mentioned because they are not easily forgettable either. So I think the time is now to rethink and reimagine our approach. And I think we have started that by putting this group together, which is across the health sciences, and the architects are here and all. And I think one of the failures has been the over-specializations, where instead of converging knowledge, we have tried to keep it separate. And we find that the solutions which are very much a part of our lives, our everyday lives, somehow fail to make any impression on us. So in this presentation, I will just start first with a bit of a conceptual background to just show where we're coming from. So if you look at it, instead of a specialized world, we need to have an integrated, holistic knowledge systems which the traditional settlements offer us. And the first point that I've raised out here is that climate resilience in Pakistan cannot be engineered solely through technical fixes or imported models. This has happened very often, and you will see examples of it later on. The other point is this, that holistic knowledge frameworks where architecture, landscape, water management, and communal governance form a single continuum of resilience. I think this is something we fail also to understand, what role ordinary people play in this whole effort. Then intervening in settlements, demands recognition of the composite logic of living, logic as living, adaptive, and adapting to infrastructures. I think that the traditional practices and settlement design within the integrated framework, we demonstrate how indigenous community engineered systems provide both the ecological sustainability and social continuity to our understanding. The diagram shows that there are three parts of it: the spatial intelligence, the ecological stewardship, and the cultural continuity, which together form the knowledge systems which are there in the traditional settlements. So this reframing position of traditional wisdom is not as a nostalgia, but it is a basic understanding of how that system works and how we can build upon it. So the holistic integration actually demands that we put communities in the central frame out here. Because to follow an integrated approach to understand, build, and develop human settlements, there is not one solution which fits all. We're somehow looking for one solution when you say, okay, what can architecture offer? There's no one solution, as traditional settlements will have taught us. There's a lot of vertical and horizontal diversity which exists within Pakistan. And I think the communities out here have found several solutions for us to look at. And those solutions are not imposed from outside, but developed over centuries of learning and understanding how to deal with their environment. We find that in Pakistan, there are two parallel systems of knowledge which exist. One is the knowledge which comes from our traditional systems, and the other knowledge is which comes from the contemporary world, the universities which offer us that knowledge. And there is no way that we have tried to try and kind of create a nexus between them. We live in two separate worlds. And I think as long as we keep living in two separate worlds, there will be no meeting point. So a paradigm shift is required, and I think that is a drastic shift which is required, which is needed. That we find solutions which are not inspired by technical solutions only, but solutions which point towards the grounded realities of our world. And our world is very different. It's very, very diverse, horizontally, vertically, climatically, geographically different. Just to bring a point that the core pillars which guide the local settlements, there's the the community custodianship that I put up front as the point number one, I think, which is important to note. And at the end, in the right-hand column, there's the climate resilience contribution that makes to that pillar. Then the settlement patterns, they contribute obviously to the passive cooling, the reduced heat island effect, and the thermal comfort that we are seeking, and the social cohesion that we see within societies, the material ecology and how that will impact the climate resilience contribution, the water systems, the nature-based solutions that we have in front of us. Then we have the social infrastructure and the economic opportunities. Now, these are integrated approaches within a traditional knowledge system. They're not segregated into specialized little pockets. So in terms of spatial intelligence, this presentation will explore the morphology of the traditional settlement pattern to understand how the spatial configuration, the social practices, and the culture merge to produce environments that are inherently resilient. So to move on, the settlement level spatial logic and climate resilience, which is at the micro level, at the macro level, they are the settlement principles which are embedded within the whole way that people think in traditional societies. That the watershed responsive siting, that is something that we have ignored for a long time, and I think it's very important to kind of keep that up front. That reduces the flood vulnerability. It enhances groundwater recharge and preserves hydrological integrity. In some recent work that we've been doing, we've been told by some of these communities along the rivers how they've discovered these old channels which existed there. Some were man-made, some were made, were natural terrain. And these were all upset during the time of the British when they came in with their canal systems. But there's evidence of that along the Sutlej River. So it's time to learn from those, happenings. Then a climate calibrated orientation, that is obviously something very important, and it improves the thermal comfort and all. And the ecological zoning and land use layering, that is also something which maintains the biodiversity and supports food sovereignty and prevents land degradation. Then the morphology of the traditional settlements and the shared commons. That is something that we have taken away from our new type of planning. Then the mobility and access is important also in the traditional societies, in the traditional settlement pattern. And the embedded livelihood infrastructure, that goes hand in hand because everybody out there is supported in some way or the other. Those of you who come from the Punjab would know how every person in a village, in a traditional society, in the remote societies, is ensured a livelihood or ensured survival. The temporal laying and ritual cycles, this is also an important aspect of that, because these are oral cultures in which you get to mark your time and your cycles and all in a different way. A little kind of that the spatial intelligence, when you say that it is embedded within the riverine systems of the Punjab, for example, where we have the 5 rivers, this is an old system. And it started with this concept of the Bela, which is the land along the riverfront. Then we had the grazing, the Duaba, we call it, which is the land between the 2 rivers. And then you had, communities which settled in a different way, and there was a whole pattern of life of how the geographical kind of geography of the land, dictated the human settlement pattern. Now this doesn't exist anymore, and because of the lack of this understanding, there are all these floods which keep happening and we do not know what to do with it. Recently in Lahore, the Ravi banks were broken by the floods and the whole area was inundated because this was a river which was made to confine in a particular way with all these barriers that were made. But it broke all the barriers. Nature has its own way. Then the architectural features, which are also part of the climate resilience at the micro level. This whole list of things, I will be talking about it in some of the case studies that I'll show you. So the topography, the orientation, the integrated cycles, the clustered housing, the livelihood ecology, and the cultural rituals and seasonal adaptation. These are some of the features that you find which exist within traditional settlements. And of course, the resilience and outcomes is on the right-hand column. Now, how do you bridge this gap? Because I am not advocating that we go back into a traditional society and start building in that way. That is not possible. But how do we learn from each other? On the one hand, we have the vernacular planning and community engineered systems. Now that we are desperate for a solution, we think that perhaps this will be the solution. But I think we also have to look at what the contemporary engineered planning has, which is based on specialization. The health people work separately, we work in our world, the scientists work in some other world, so there's no meeting point for us. There's no forums, there's no discussion across, there's no understanding of how we can together resolve this issue. When we say vernacular planning, we usually mean something that has just happened by accident, somewhere down the line in history that occurred. We forget that this is a community engineered system. I was with a very large organization the other day. We were having a discussion with their director, and he kept talking about it, that the scientific way of doing things. So I said, you mean that traditional settlements were not scientifically based, perhaps in a different These are community engineered over centuries of, knowledge that is embedded there. So the whole point is to try and create a nexus between these two worlds. So the nexus can be, of course, because there are two different systems. One is based on evidence, which is noted, data collected, analyzed. You have computers, you have this, that, and everything else, all the gadgets. On the other side is the oral kind of traditions, which retain in memory all that they have, knowledge that is retained only in memory. So can we have a meeting point between those two? Then we have another, issue that, our educational institutions, and I am very honored to be here in the Aga Khan, which is one of our leading universities. But we live in a completely different world. We have never brought in the traditional knowledge systems within this world. We have not tried to create the nexus between these two knowledge systems. And I think that is a very big failing on the part of educationists. And I've spent my life in education, so I am, putting myself in that to be blamed. So we need to also institutionalize the community custodianship. And in the examples, you'll see some things that I will like to talk about. Now, I'm just showing about 4 case studies, and all of these are personal experiences. This is the first one is from the Cholistan Desert. The second one will be from the Lipa Valley, which is in Azad Kashmir, and then the Kailash Valley in district Chitral, and the walled city of Lahore, which is an urban, where the urban poor are now more or less there. So if you look at the settlement patterns of in the Chitral area, the impact of climate change, it is absolutely terrifying to be there and to watch that happen. The rising temperatures, last year it went up to about, I think, 54 degrees centigrade, and it is intolerable to be in that desert. The water scarcity is huge, and it is getting even worse. Just on a lighter side, in the 225, in the recent floods, the Hakra River, which dried up 3,500 years ago, suddenly came with water. So there was a lot of celebration in the desert. Then there's the ecosystem degradation. The desertification that you see there is absolutely appalling. It is unimaginable. The disturbance on the livelihoods and on life in general is completely, it's not imaginable outside the desert, really, that kind of threats to livelihood. And then the migration pressures. What do people do? These were semi-nomadic people who have now to move out of the desert more frequently. And when they move out, what happens? They're moving out in search of water, in search of livelihood. They are now destitute. They are in an area that they are not familiar with. And the first thing that happens, of course, is the erosion of cultural knowledge. They will assimilate within the urban cities, become the urban poor of those cities. And all that knowledge that they carry will die with their elders. So there will be no transference of that knowledge to the younger generation. Then there will be, of course, a diminished resilience. They had found ways to cope at a certain level, but now it's gone beyond that. Then the loss of cultural identity, the mental stress due to a displacement, and the social disharmony which occurs, obviously, because now you're desperate. You're living in a desperate kind of a situation. And the communities get pushed much below the poverty line. Incidentally, they're already below the poverty line, so this will be even worse. Now, this is a basti within the Cholistan Desert. It looks very nice and charming and very beautiful. This is near the border of India, and it is near a fort. So there are a number of forts within the desert. And the settlement pattern is dispersed clusters that you see out here. And the sources of water are the tobas, which are the rainwater harvesting ponds that you find there. Then they've got the kunds and the wells and the water pipeline, which has just recently been laid along the Hakra River. This is the housing pattern out there. And this is one of the settlements where people live for longer out here. They don't have to move out that frequently. And you see these two type of housing patterns out there. I'm not going to go into the architectural details of it. This is a kund. The kunds are these wells that have been made out there, these pits in the ground, which are covered with gypsum because gypsum is easily available out there. And these are rainwater, they are collecting rainwater. So they are there for longer for people to kind of at least have drinking water and all that. And there are two types of kunds which exist, one which mixes also the saline water in it. This is again, this is a toba, a pond. Now this is something that I'd like to kind of, the technical solutions, the outside solutions which come in, which are only of a technical nature. So you find that there's been an intervention in the desert where these tobas have been made by the government, and they've been made deeper. They've been made 20 feet deep. These are the ponds where both the animals and the humans get their water from. And, the first time I saw that, I was completely shocked because I couldn't understand how this is not causing a lot of disease. And when the government came in, they dug this water, they made the tombs, these deeper, and they also changed the management system of it. This is a water resource which is the most precious thing in a desert, and it was community-led and community-organized. So they changed the system and superimposed another committee on top of it, which just killed the whole thing. And we went there once with a big UNESCO delegation, and those people said, okay, please tell them that we cannot even access water anymore because we are charged 50 rupees every time we go for a picture. So you change a system and it has big impact on the life of people there. And you see at the bottom right picture, the traditional toba. Now just to, as health professionals, you may be interested in how they keep their water clean. There are a number of plants which they have grown around the toba, which have different ways to keep the water clean and drinkable, let us say, both for humans and for, the animals. And maybe, this knowledge came to them through the Harappa civilization, which is 5,000 years ago, because you find these rainwater harvesting ponds and tanks there as well. This has been discovered by the archaeologists, so I'm just guessing on that. I really don't know. But these are the trees, and there are a number of them out there. There's also a tree which has become very famous now because it's that Moranga oleifera, where they're using the seeds of it to chemically purify the water. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, I cannot vouch for it, but this is what we are told. Then the ak tree, ak plant, which is just a weed out here, is the life of people, the medical kind of a solution for so many things for them, snake bites and all those different types of diseases. So you find people have found solutions in a natural kind of a way, and maybe that needs to be understood by people who come from the health sciences. In terms of the community custodianship, the importance of it cannot be underrated, because once that is disturbed, and you cannot take them on board, and when interventions happen from outside, they do not take the community on board. They come from top, They do that thing. They give technical solutions which are not workable for them because they're made to feel that their knowledge is inferior. Maybe it is, but at least it's their knowledge. And it needs to be also brought in harmony with what the others are offering. And they have a whole system. I mean, when we started working there, we first tried to understand their honor code and take those points of it which were important for our understanding of how to work with communities. And they have land and water rights. You take away those rights, the whole system gets disturbed. It's an ecosystem. So likewise, the kingship loyalties and the conflict resolutions and all. So in terms of the community, why community custodianship matters, I think that is a point where we are all trying to work also in various, low income and, rural situations. So I think it needs to be kept, at least it needs to be pointed out, that a top-down approach without taking the confidence of the communities, without trying to understand, what their knowledge system is, I think is starting on the wrong foot. Then the custodianship ensures the continuity of the knowledge system. Once you take that away from them, that means that they have no reason to transfer it to the younger generation. There's nothing for them to transfer anymore. And I think also, we are, in fact, the custodian, since it strengthens the intellectual property rights because it's theirs. So once you take that away, you've absolutely weakened them and you've taken away their property rights to some knowledge that they own. I mean, in the university, we talk of plagiarism, and we are penalized for that. But we're quite happy to take that knowledge away without crediting anybody for it. And these are the rightful, inheritors of that knowledge. Then the collective agency, because they work as communities. So the first example is, this next example is from the Lipa Valley. We had the opportunity to go there as a group of people who were sent by UNESCO to see what was happening, because UNESCO had been approached in Islamabad that there were traditional houses there which had survived the earthquake. So they made a little, group of people to go there and see what was happening. So when we arrived there, we found that Lipa Valley is very remote. It's next to the India border, and it's very difficult to access there. So they live in, it's also restricted entry. So a lot of their knowledge system that they have is actually the very old system that they continue with. So it's, the first thing we noticed was the status of women out there. Because normally in the Punjab, unfortunately, the women are second-grade citizens. So you find that the women out here have a lot of agency and they're very strong. And soon enough that you find out that they move up into the hills during the summer months, and there they make all they grow the vegetables, they herd the cattle or whatever, they plant herbs, and there's a huge wealth of knowledge out there on herbs. I just happened to ask the driver, okay, what is the tree for something? And he pointed at every tree and told me, this is good for that, this is good for that. So there's knowledge there somewhere. So this was the performance of the housing out there. That out of the total of 3,253 houses, 2 had completely been destroyed, and those were the ones that they called the contemporary construction, the pakka one or the one made with concrete and all. And the timber construction of houses had survived. There were only a few which had gone out of plumb, which means they had got tilted. The rest were standing fine. And to show you, and this is an example at the left bottom corner of how they managed to put them back into plumb. And they were being forced now by the government to build in a particular manner because, otherwise they would not get the money allocated to them for their house building. So this was the man that we found. We started looking at it, who had built these houses. And you come across these knowledge bearers out there who had actually built all these houses. And when we examined them closely, you find that they were all built with all those things that we now know to be, earthquake resilient way of building. So this is one man, and we know him, and we know his name. We put his name down, because that's important. If we want our names to be known, we should also honor the people who built there. Okay, this is a 5-story house which survived the earthquake. And there was also a 6-story house which survived the earthquake. And the only thing that happened that on the ground level, on the lower level, how they had infill walls, stone walls, which are infill between timber posts, and that were knocked out. So it was no damage to the house. The house was stable. And this is to recognize the fact that the institution, there was an institutional recognition, and they allowed the traditional house form to be also built. They gave some kind of guidelines, okay, do it like that. But they used all the tradition bearers to do that work in the valley, and also in the other valleys of Azad Kashmir, and also in the other areas where the earthquake had been quite disastrous. This is just another example, because I couldn't resist putting it. It's a mosque, and it is huge. It's got a 70-feet, span, and it was just of timber, and it didn't even move. And there was this earthquake which destroyed the 2 contemporary houses. One of the things you note out there, which is just to point out that there are symbols there. We didn't have the time to go into it, what it means and all. Maybe this is a way of conveying the oral knowledge into some form which is understandable by communities there. The next example is from Kalasha. This is a terraced, cluster of houses. And this is a very complex settlement pattern. The spatial logic out there really takes you a while to understand how it works. And Zara, who's been working there also quite a lot, she'll probably talk more about it. But it's on the basis of pure and impure. And then there is this, the non-binary spaces that they've created. There are spaces which are, the impure spaces. You see them in yellow out here. So there's a whole logic around which this whole area has been, functions. So I'll leave Zara to talk a bit more about that later. But it's a very interesting thing. Now, you go and intervene there from outside. And I've just heard that somebody's now going there with some kind of a planning. And there's going to be an utter disaster, because they will never understand this complex system. It has to be the community who takes custodianship of that, and perhaps a facilitator, but not, imposing another form onto them. This is just examples to show you what the place looks like. And their whole belief system is, they're largely non-Muslim people there. And they have a lot of, interesting beliefs. Their major deity is, Balmain. Then, again, a little bit more about, how this place functions. And what I want to really show you, this is their housing style. I mean, I think only the architects would be interested in something like that. But it's all timber. It's all, built by them. And it is a continuity of that which still happens, and they love their houses and the way they function. This is what I wanted to show you, because, within that system, in the tradition in the Kalasha people. This is Suri Jagik, which means it's a calendar that they make, which is based on, it's an calendar. It tells them when to sow, when to reap, when to do what. And it's also a ritual calendar. This has now been recognized by UNESCO, and it's on the Intangible Cultural Heritage list from Pakistan as a urgent safeguarding kind of an element which has been placed there. This is a council of elders which are in charge of it, and there are people out there who actually measure this in a scientific way, evidence-based, where they kind of like look at how the position of the sun and the moon and the stars and all that, and they figure out okay, when is the right time to sow. So this is probably the most ancient calendar which still exists within this one area that we know of. It may be there elsewhere also. Now this is what is happening there now, that a new type of construction has started coming in, funded by the donors and designed by the outsiders. And it goes against the way that they are traditionally building. Okay, now the third example is from the walled city of Lahore. We've worked in that area which is marked yellow. And of course, it's, for those of you who are familiar with that, I don't need to repeat it, but it has its own spatial logic. And the main point of that is that it has a lot of community spirit, a lot of care for each other. In our new areas in Lahore, we don't even know our neighbor. I don't know my neighbor. I don't come from that traditional kind of a settlement pattern which still exists in Lahore. This is our prime walled city in the whole country. And so the original, this is such a continuity that even when neighbors change, we call something mohalladari. So there is still that help for each other. There's still that feeling of community, which does not exist. I'm sure it doesn't exist in Karachi in most areas. It's the fragmented societies we're looking at. This is the kind of layout and the pattern that you find in the walled city, which is small spaces. There's gendered space. There's places which are private streets. You cannot go in there, although they look like any street. But you have to understand how the system works. And the whole walled city offers a lot of opportunities to understand and learn, and understand what the spatial intelligence and logic there is. Now, this is another example of how people, even now, are trying to kind of bring in some of the features of resilience within the design that they are making. This is in the desert, not in the desert strictly, but within what we call the lesser desert area of South Punjab. And it's a lot of greenery there. It's been designed in a way it's a primary school. Now, what is the way forward? Okay, these two women should also be there. These are some of the pictures of the tradition bearers out there. They have names. They have knowledge. But where do they fit into our system? They're nowhere, because we've never tapped their knowledge. We've never used a scientific way to collect that data, which is embedded within that oral system that they are inheritors of. So I think this is a good starting point, that we recognize the knowledge bearers. We recognize that intangible cultural heritage that they have with them needs to be also inventoried, it needs to be documented, it needs to be put into a data bank so that we can also look at it and understand how it's been functioning, all right? And there are people who have worked on it, but there's much more work that needs to be done, and by many, many more people. So the way forward, I think, one is there's the acceptance that this knowledge is knowledge. It's community engineered, community based, but it is knowledge. Then the acknowledgement of the tradition bearers, I think it is extremely important, because we are appropriating their knowledge and claiming it as ours. I think this is a very wrong thing that is setting in our society. I do not wish to name that company, but there are people who use their designs and make a lot of money on it, and they are their designs, that's their creation. If I wear chundri, it is their chundri. You know, Madhavata? If a factory makes it and makes a lot of money on it, then they have appropriated somebody's knowledge. And they have, and as universities, as responsible educationists, I think we need to move on that front. Then there's no legislation in Pakistan, and I hope you'll put that as one of your recommendations, that there should be a legislation to cover the intangible cultural heritage, whose rightful owners are communities, groups, and sometimes individuals. These are people whose knowledge should be tapped, documented, put in your data banks, used but with acknowledgement of where it comes from. And they should be beneficiaries of it. They should have some monetary benefit. We call them the poorest of the poor. They will always remain poor unless we act with responsibility. So that, I think, is something that is our responsibility. And I think in my last thing that I think we should definitely put the custodian, the community custodianship as one of our recommendations, if I could request that. And also put culture as a cross-cutting theme in your development. We talk of development, we're taking ideas from here, there, and everywhere. And we're going into these very areas and doing all of that, but not really reaching anywhere. We're still, facing all the issues of climate change issues and all. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vantal, for that incredible and very informative presentation. Our next keynote session will be delivered by Christopher Berman and Joseph Augustine, Senior Research Fellows and Lecturers at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College London. Christopher Berman is an urban technologist and designer whose work focuses on climate adaptation, low-resource architectural design, and heat-resilient built environments. His experience includes developing global digital platforms for urban and climate data, such as PatchPay, later acquired by Google, and he currently serves as technical lead on Action Builder, a national initiative in the United Kingdom supporting the creation of zero-carbon school buildings. Joseph Augustine is a practicing architect and researcher specializing in environmental design, with experience ranging from master planning a carbon-neutral town in North Africa to designing education, housing, and community buildings that blend advanced building technologies with low-carbon vernacular approaches. His work also includes deep retrofits of historic buildings in London, enhancing energy performance, occupant health, and climate resilience. Together, they serve as co-investigators on SHAPES, a major global research initiative led by University College London, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the Aga Khan University, funded by the Wellcome Trust, exploring how to improve heat resilience and climate adaptation in public spaces. Their keynote presentation is titled Climate-Friendly Urban Architecture, Best Practices. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Christopher Berman and Joseph Augustine.
Thank you. Before we begin, I just want to express our sincere thanks for the invitation to Dr. Butta and Dr. Das and the IGHD team here at the Aga Khan University. For nearly 2 years, we've been working under their leadership with Dr. Anna Bonnell at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to understand heat risk in Karachi, mapping exposure, studying lived experience, and exploring strategies for healthier and more resilient environments. This is our 4th visit to Karachi, and each time we return, we're reminded of the generosity, the openness, and the depth of engagement that make this collaboration so meaningful. Today, we're going to offer some reflections on current approaches and look at emerging tools and ask how do we shape the built environment in an era of climate instability, rapid urbanization, and profound social inequality. We are often asked, what are the most sustainable urban buildings in the world? Which global model should we learn from? What is the state of the art? Our collective definitions of what best practice actually is has begun to shift profoundly. Up until recently, energy efficiency of a building was used as the primary goal. High-tech, high-performance, often high-rise buildings, sometimes covered in planting, but often glass and steel with complex mechanical cooling systems requiring skilled labor and imported components. These are not scalable models for cities that are rapidly growing, dealing with extreme heat, electricity instability, informal housing, and resource constraints. A vivid example is the Bloomberg headquarters in London. When it opened in 2017, it immediately won the RIBA's prestigious Sterling Prize. It was declared the most sustainable office building in the world and achieved the highest ever BREEAM score of 98.6%. It featured vacuum toilets using rainwater, 500,000 LEDs, and custom aluminium cooling petals. But the building cost £1 billion to build. It required shipments of 600 tons of Japanese bronze, 10,000 tons of Indian granite, and bespoke systems that cannot be replicated anywhere else. For many in the UK, it was part of a wider wake-up call and a moment of profound self-realization, mistaking technical performance for environmental ethics, mistaking cost for quality, and complexity for sustainability. In London, a kind of shame and despair had descended across conversations. There were large convenings, kind of panicked declarations and calls to action, that our cities needed something very different in the face of existential climate uncertainty. So, I mean, 3 systems that we must rebuild, essentially. To imagine a more realistic and equitable path, we must adapt and rebuild 3 systems simultaneously. Our material systems, what we build with, how materials circulate and how we reduce embodied energy. Our environmental systems, how buildings mediate heat, humidity, and comfort. How cities function as climate ecologies using hydrology and drainage, tree canopies and permeable structures, and microclimate creation through shade networks. And most importantly, as we touched on in the previous presentation, which was just incredible, social and institutional systems, governance, care and maintenance, land frameworks, participation, and community capacity. So true sustainability is not a technological achievement, it's a governance achievement, a spatial achievement, and a collective achievement. We also need to be honest. In the climate we're entering, cooling will be necessary. Passive strategies are essential, but will not always be sufficient for those most vulnerable, especially in humid, high, wet bulb conditions, which occur here in Karachi. International best practice needs to follow 3 steps. First, reduce the cooling load, as has been touched on. Shading, reflected surfaces, cross-ventilation, ventilated roofs, night flushing, all the kind of measures that we can think of. Making full use of ambient heat sinks, often directly building on ways which we have done so for hundreds of years. Second, use low emissions active systems for what remains. Fans, evaporative cooling, hybrid heat pumps, desiccant dehumidification, and radiant cooling. And thirdly, optimizing a hybrid of these 2 approaches, which is absolutely essential. Passive plus hybrid plus active is the future, not air conditioning alone and not passive alone in most scenarios in an urban environment. Extreme heat and humidity will continue to push vulnerable households into periods where mechanical cooling becomes a matter of health, not comfort. The task to make cooling efficient, affordable, and low carbon, and not to eliminate it. We're just going to touch on a few case studies very briefly, just in outline, really. Last month, we exhibited at the 14th Sao Paulo Architecture Biennale. The curation team avoided global centers of architectural prestige and highlighting instead the growing edges, placing typically unseen, innovating under constraint, scarcity, and climate pressure. These are sites where new governance, new material cultures, and new social infrastructures are emerging. Just to bring a few to our attention here today. First one, architecture on the outskirts, based in Brazil, supports women-led technical assistance for planning and building their own homes. They undertake training and co-design using earth plasters, bamboo ceilings, green roofs, seeing architecture as political ecology, agency, and empowerment. Vertigo Archive, so small team which systematically is also in Salvador in Brazil, visits buildings slated for demolition, salvaging windows, doors, beams. These are checked in, stored, catalogued, and sold, creating a material bank for renovation and reuse. And turning waste streams into low-carbon construction resource whilst contributing to local green jobs, pipeline, and circular economy. Some of you be familiar with CATCOM, the Catalytic Communities Network in Rio de Janeiro, which reframes the favela not as a problem but as a community asset, promoting land rights, tenure security, and equity through community land trusts to build long-term resilience. It comes back to that point made earlier about ownerships and empowerment. So microclimate and infrastructure improvements led by residents themselves, offering protection from displacement and speculative land grabs. This project in Puerto Rico, Cano Martin Pena, again, the use of community land trust model, using participatory planning and managed retreat to protect flood-prone informal settlements and improve health outcomes. The image above reads, and for the first time, we, the residents, were the leaders of our future. And there's some community leaders there next to it. The bottom image you can see is an aerial photograph where we see just how close the community is to the economic center. You can see the kind of shift in scale there. And they're being supported and retained in that geography. And then very quickly, a bit closer to home for us, but Wolves Lane in North London, a community food growing enterprise hub, rebuilt through reuse and regenerative design principles. These kinds of urban interventions offer food security, training, and intergenerational enterprise, and demonstrate that climate adaptation is not a project or a building type. It's a social and institutional shift grounded in material realism and community capacity. I'll hand over to Chris, but these principles are universally useful but are locally shaped. The challenge and the opportunity is to build a new hybrid model rooted in local architectural intelligence, informed by global research in cooling and climate adaptation. So by focusing on equity, governance, and material realism, we're designing to protect life in extreme heat. And this is not a technical challenge alone. It is a civic project, a public health project, and it is a cultural project, ultimately. I'll pass it to Chris.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christopher Berman. I'd also just like to add a slight correction. In the introduction, it sort of gave the impression that we were leading the project with AKU. We are very much the junior partners in this, and it's been a real pleasure to work on it. I just wanted to make sure it was clear that we really deeply respect the work that AKU is producing. This presentation is structured around sort of taking some of these conversations and zooming in a bit on what we've learned about Karachi during the project, and trying to kind of categorize some approaches. We'll explore a little bit about urban scale heat adaptation, the challenges specifically for Karachi, and then talk about some of the tools and it maybe segues quite neatly with the first presentation we had about this nexus between the kind of technical considerations and community projects. Just as a kind of headline start, I think it's useful to kind of categorize the approach for scaling, thinking about extreme heat adaptation at the urban scale into kind of three categories. We have the idea of the urban canopy, the adaptation of the roofscape layer. We have the streetscape and the public space. And then we have a kind of consideration of what new development patterns will then contribute in addition to the city. And these things kind of working in parallel together. We're not going to focus so much on the last, but we'll talk a little bit about the first two. I'll share a few more case studies in this. And also just to echo this point that essentially research into extreme heat has become perhaps the central theme for a lot of architectural research production at this moment in time. For instance, the Bahrain Pavilion at the Venice Biennale, which is the kind of central architectural gathering that happens every 2 years, won the major prize, and it's an exploration of kind of producing cooling spaces in the public realm using geothermal energy. Another project that was shown there was a team of architects called Roofscape Studio who deal exclusively with roofscape transformation across Paris. This is one of the projects they're working on, which is a large-scale transformation of kind of a cooling project and planting. And building on this idea of how we think about the public realm, this idea about shade maps that is emerging, I wanted to bring this to people's attention, the treatment of shade as an infrastructural kind of commodity in itself, that we might make a parallel with street lights or public health provision of different kinds, that shade as both a subject of study to be mapped, but also to kind of be provided for citizens is increasingly sort of rising in importance. And I also just wanted to highlight some what we were introduced to that's happening at LUMS, and this kind of relates to the research into kind of new development patterns of new housing and retrofit, perhaps less in the domain of informal housing, which we're going to talk a bit more about, but I wanted to draw this report to everyone's attention, which is extremely detailed kind of package of solutions for Pakistan. So I want to talk a bit about Karachi specifically. The project we're working on is both in the rural and urban context, but kind of draw attention to the city that we're in at the moment, which is dense, extremely hot, as I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, and complex. It has a messy morphology and patterns of development, which makes it particularly challenging if you're going to think about how you're going to cool this city down, and rapidly. The project has involved a kind of investigation of a series of what kind of interventions could be brought to bear rapidly and cost effectively. We're not going to go into detail about this. This is not really the time to kind of break these down, but just to say that the backdrop of this is thinking about how cooling could be brought within a kind of urban realm as cost effectively and quickly as possible, with respect to available materials and construction techniques. The backdrop to this, of course, is that thinking ahead and thinking back, if we look back kind of 25 years to 2000 and think about how Karachi has developed, one of the challenges of Karachi is the extreme growth in urban development. You can see here this, we are all aware that Karachi has an extreme vulnerability to heat events. A large part of this is the pattern of development that's happened in the last 25 and 50 years. And if we're thinking ahead about this, as part of this, putting together this presentation, wanted to do a sort of thought experiment about this, about how we situate the next 25 years of development when we think about what might happen. And I was kind of thinking this, that I was trying to locate if it was possible to put figures against this that would allow us to think about the scale of the challenge ahead. And so I was going to, these numbers potentially, people might dispute them. They're kind of, I've used the phrase back of a napkin potentially, but they're from cited sources. Roughly speaking, the current population of Karachi is 20 million. There's about 3.4 million households, of which about 1 to 1.2 million estimated to be households that live in informal settlements. So if we try to sort of put a figure on this from the point of view of the number of sites or locations of informal dwellings that might might benefit from some form of heat adaptation, we might be estimating something around 600,000 roofscapes or urban sites. And the key figure that I want to draw everyone's attention to here is that if we think into the next 25 years development, that would require 24,000 urban adaptations per year, which roughly speaking is about 100 per day. And I think this is the kind of key metric that I would like to have in people's mind, that the challenge may be time rather than resources or organization. But if we then also factor into how Karachi will grow, the population is likely to rise to 28 to 33 million, give or take, perhaps 5 or 6 million households in total by then. But the informal population is likely to double in that same time frame. So into this mix, also introduced about another million or so informal households. So you also have to contend with that. Are those dwellings adapted before they're built? Are they adapted after? And what is the design pattern of how that looks? But then it might scale up to about 200 a day. So we're looking at a kind of ticking clock of how much heat adaptation can actually be brought to bear. The reason these figures, Joseph and I were discussing this a bit, is this is something that's happening in the UK at the moment where everyone is trying to sense check the scale at which environmental kind of transformation of the built environment can take place. Just like how fast can it be done? Like how much resource, how many people are able to bring this like kind of grand project into fruition. So I thought I'd plant these seeds in our mind about the time frames required. And talk a bit about just shading in particular, because it's likely that shading is going to be the most cost-effective kind of part, well, that's a very significant cost-effective part of the process. Studies in Saudi Arabia show that just a sort of basic redesign and configuration of shading structures can increase their effectiveness a great deal. In fact, the use of natural materials and the spacing of shading devices really critical to how they succeed. I'm going to talk through a few examples of how the project is then exploring how this might come to pass. Just to show that this is a thermal scan of Dhobi Ghat, which is previously one of the regions that was involved in the study. And you can see here the sheer complexity of the landscape that might be considered, the sort of range of materials, range of thermal conditions, just even in a small area. The other thing I would just say is that this is sort of through the use of drone thermography, it's revealing patterns of heat and exposure that were not previously available. And this is quite high resolution. But one of the other things as we progress through this is that if we're going to build up some experimental understanding of the performance of different materials in this environment, this is one of the test setups, this is from Mitiari, just looking at different material buildups, how do they perform? We start to need to kind of look at them from the other way up. And so I'm going to just demonstrate something in a second. But one of the things we've been doing is looking at the ways we might measure the success of different shading structures. So we've been working on some devices to actually thermally kind of measure what we can see. I brought one with me, which is the next one, and I'll show you some demonstrations of this in a second. This is a relatively low-cost sensor device that unusually operates directly up, looking straight at a ceiling to understand the thermal performance of a roof and roof modifications. I'll give a little demo of this, because what you're seeing here is a sort of 24-hour period of the sky being shaded by a shading structure. And what you can see here is actually the sun passing over. And we're seeing for the first time actually how that might perform in this given kind of condition. But what's exciting about this as you start to build up maybe a library of this kind of information is that we can see directly how different shading structures will serve to, in different environments, different orientations to kind of better shield the inhabitants of a building. Critical to this is because of the kind of messiness of the condition of the urban environment, there's a concept called the performance gap, which is we can specify all the products that we might think would be ideal in this situation, but it's actually unlikely that they will perform as we expect. So we need to be able to see and visualize what that information, how these materials are performing. This is feeding directly into the study, we hope. And this is one of the shade structures which has been built as a part of the pilot. I wanted to draw your attention also to the plan of the building. We're using LiDAR technology to rapidly survey the buildings, which gives us the ability to understand geometrically far quicker than you would be able to if you were performing a manual survey. And it also reveals details about the building's construction, orientation, and suitability to shading. So what we're seeing here is a slice through a building that would otherwise be kind of impossible to generate, but is done through a LiDAR scan that takes about 2.5 minutes to perform, and it can be done by hand. When we move into the kind of rural condition, one of the things we're trying to understand is the speed at which these things can be scaled, the suitability of different shading structures, their orientation, the amount of materials that are used, all come to pass as kind of necessary considerations in scaling up shading scheme. I want to show this. This is an example of, we've been kind of exploring, essentially, if you start to plug in the conditions of orientation and material use and the size of a building, can you essentially make a parametric pattern that you could pass on to people and say, this is the amount of bamboo that's going to be required to develop a cheap shading structure, but with it we know that it will be safe, secure, easy to build, and reliable, but also perform optimally. So this is a double ventilated split pitch roof. The orientation and the kind of scaling the details actually make a very consequential impact on the suitability of it as a shading device. And the idea generally is that this information can be integrated together, and we can start to plug that into thermal models that we actually understand before things are built if they're really going to be effective. And we can locate them in other previously difficult to survey locations. I want to show two more things here, which is part of this has also been the development of tools to understand through community engagement with people, inhabitants, about this, the current state of their dwellings. I want to show you a quick demo of I'm going to show it in English, and then it can be translated into Urdu. But essentially, it collates all the information, visual information, photographs that have been taken, and drone information in one go, so that it's possible to work with communities and ask a kind of chain of questions that will result in a potential intervention being possible to specify. So there are kind of core underlying questions that designers, architects, and engineers will need to know if it's possible to specify shading structures in complex environments. And this kind of has to be done structure by structure, because the structures themselves vary so much in their design. And this comes together. So this is a map that was created of that environment. It's a kind of interactive digital tool that would allow you to click on any of these buildings and then run the same set of questions, look at all the additional information that's being collected together, and start to understand the different distribution of potential shading devices. It's not just shading, it might be cool paint, solar interventions, green roofs, that can be deployed. And this might give you a bit of a clue of, just like in a very small area, how different the likely palette of interventions is likely to be. It's not a one-size-fits-all by any means, and there's also a number of different considerations that have to be kind of taken into consideration. So I'm going to wrap up, but kind of come back to this idea about the idea of the scale of this challenge. So we go back to these original numbers and just kind of think about them. I'm in the spirit of, what's the word? In the spirit of sort of being outside of one's comfort zone, I'm going to sort of cosplay as an economic development specialist for 2 seconds. I'm absolutely not, it's not my background at all. How would you cost this? Like, how much does it cost? And I think, surprisingly, if you do the sort of napkin maths of this, you can arrive at costs for deploying 600,000 shading interventions or green roofs at relatively small cost across Karachi. Well, depending which way you're measuring the kind of small costs of a project, but this, within the frame of reference, isn't particularly onerous, perhaps. If you factor in potentially the housing which has yet to be built, like maybe we're in the region of like $1 billion of kind of capital works that would need to be undertaken. Bear in mind, some of the shading structures might be $180 or $200. Like, it's within the realm of possibility. So the question is, what is the cost of no action? Because maybe I can't speak to necessarily where this money might arrive from, but we can think about what the cost would be if we don't take action to cool down the cities in which we inhabit. So I wanted to just draw your attention to some kind of economic modeling around that, which I think will maybe help us understand what might accelerate these concerns. The sort of most precise economic model, I think, of the heat impacts of a city is in Dhaka, where the estimation is about 8% of Dhaka's annual GDP is currently it's being lost as a result of extreme heat, and that's projected to go up to 10% yearly by 2050. In Pakistan, I think it's the estimation by the World Bank is it's about 4.4% of GDP, about $16 billion a year is already being lost through extreme heat, and that's projected to go up significantly as well. And then if we just kind of think about Karachi as itself, I want to include this other statistic as well, just this idea that we're sort of moving into a world in which maybe for peak summer periods, instead of it being extreme heat events, the whole summer is now being maybe considered as a kind of extreme heat in and of itself. If you kind of tease the numbers out of this and you look at this 16 billion figure for Karachi at this for Pakistan at this moment in time, maybe not unreasonable to think that at this moment in time, about $1 billion to $1.5 billion per year of economic loss is being caused in Pakistan as a result of extreme heat. So if we go back a slide, it pays for itself. And I think this is one of the things that I would sort of put forward is that what the barriers to realizing these projects might kind of actually be. I'm going to end on a slightly strange slide here, which is this is a really interesting report into the scaling of low-income climate-smart housing. And I was particularly struck by this for a reason, which is that this is sort of describing the government structures around how you might resolve large-scale climate-smart housing. And it strikes me, and this is kind of the proposal I'd like to leave everybody with, because I think that there's a huge amount of expertise and talent in this room, essentially, that understands these problems intuitively, that there's a gap in the middle of this for a coalition of civic organizations to be filled. And I think if you put together a 25-year time horizon, the need to arrive at about $1 billion of investment in climate resilient solutions across a city, and the need to scale up the labor force around that challenge, this seems eminently solvable. But again, to speak to this question about communities and civic involvement, it may not be a question for the government to solve alone. And it'd be very heartening to hear the Minister give such a clear-headed strategy. And I wonder if the output of the conversation today is to meet in the middle from the point of view of coalescing with a strategy in mind. So I will leave it there and say thank you very much.
I'd like to thank both our speakers, Christopher and Joseph. Moving on, our final keynote for today will be presented by Dr. Zahra Hussain, founder and director of Largeword. By the way, Dr. Zahra, I'm wearing this jacket in solidarity with you. Dr. Zahra Hussain is an architect and human geographer whose work focuses on cultural landscape, vulnerable mountain ecologies, and community-driven conservation across Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. She's a fellow of the Higher Education Academy and leads several international projects on heritage, ecologies, vernacular architecture, and climate adaptation. Her research situates local knowledge and traditional building practices at the center of climate resilience design. Her keynote is titled Traditional Architecture in the Fragile Mountain Ecologies of the Hindu Kush Himalayas, Case of Community Conservation Lab. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Zahra Hussain.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. And will this be turned on, the screen? So let me begin by taking you to the northern edge of Pakistan. So we've been hearing about the south. Let's hear a little bit about the north. Yeah. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Into the Hindu Kush Himalayas, a landscape of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary volatility. These are mountains that are still rising, still shifting, and they hold the largest ice mass outside the poles, over 7,000 glaciers mapped, and they are the water towers of Pakistan. But they're also deeply fragile ecologies where extreme temperatures, narrow valleys, and steep gradients shape everyday life. In the past decade, as the climate has warmed almost twice the global average in this region, this fragility has become more visible, more abrupt, and more deeply felt. Flash floods, erratic snowfall, glacial lake outburst floods, sudden weather shifts, these are not incidents, they have become the atmosphere within which life is lived. And it is in this context that I want to think with you about traditional architecture that has evolved in negotiation with these exact forms of fragility. What I share today draws from our ongoing work at the Community Conservation Lab at Largeword, where we try to ask harder questions about how we build, how we plan, and how to recover the knowledge that has evolved in conversation with these mountains, and to ask what kind of future buildings become possible if we attend to it. When the state or development agencies talk about fragility, they often speak in the language of hazards. Floods, avalanches, glacial lake outburst floods, landslides. But the communities of the Hindu Kush Himalaya inhabit a landscape that has always moved geologically, climatically, and culturally. Life here has evolved in constant negotiations with the shifting slopes, advancing glaciers, and rivers that change course. Seasonal migrations, cyclical labor, and even the shifting of rooms and kitchens reflects a deep familiarity with the instability, not as an exception, but as a condition of living. Fragility in the Hindu Kush Himalaya is simply not a catalogue of risks. It is structural, historical, and relational. It is not a one-off event that has to be managed. It is a condition within which life unfolds. Modern life, however, asks for something different: accessibility, connectivity across terrains and valleys, and a mode of living that has not yet learned to move with or respond to the rhythm of the mountains. And so what was once a landscape of managed instability becomes a stage of systemic rupture. A single landslide can cut off tens of thousands of people, a flood can darken an entire valley for weeks, a sudden cold spell can drive families out of their newly built homes into their thermally comfortable ones, which are the older ones. Infrastructure falters, economies stall, houses leak. Fragility does not strike once, it reorganizes life, recalibrates relations, and exposes the limits of human intervention. In this context, any building practice that sees fragility as an external hazard risks becoming part of the problem. Architecture does not exist outside this instability, it is entangled within it. Against this backdrop, the traditional architecture of the Hindu Kush Himalayas reveals a way of building attuned to the conditions of the mountains that Ms. Sarjita Vandal spoke really brilliantly about. These structures evolved slowly through generations of experimentation, adaptation, and sustained dialogue with the natural environment. They are traditional not because of stylistic choice or aesthetic preference, but because they exist within and respond to the fragile conditions of the landscape. Houses move with the seasons, kitchens and storage spaces shift with the human and livestock patterns, and pastures are accessed as part of the seasonal circulation. The use of soil, stone, and timber is the most obvious and logical response. Soil to buffer thermal fluctuations, stone to anchor structures on steep slopes, and timber to absorb seismic shocks. Settlements orient toward the sun, shield from prevailing winds, and fold into slopes rather than override them. What is critical is that this architecture is relational, not formal. Forms do not precede practice, they emerge from labor rhythms, agricultural cycles, communal repair, and the distributed knowledge of ustads through kinship and apprenticeship. Architecture is not built to endure hazards, it endures because it participates in them. It is relational, enacted, and inseparable from the entangled conditions that make habitation possible. Architecture here, in the Hindu Kush Himalayas, is managed as relation, not replicated as form. Yet this relational system is under intense pressure. Gilgit-Baltistan and the northern parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa today receives almost 1 million domestic tourists annually. Hydropower networks, water channels, and waste management infrastructures are stretched beyond their capacities. Valleys report seasonal water shortages as guest houses compete with households for the same finite hydrological resources. And alongside this tourism surge comes a construction surge. Mid-sized hotels, guest houses, and commercial plazas rapidly rising across the valleys, with cement and concrete as the default material palette. The cement monoculture is not an aesthetic shift. It needs to be understood as an ecological rupture. And why do I say that? Because cement and concrete are thermally rigid materials that perform poorly under extreme temperature fluctuations. making them fundamentally unfit for environmental stresses of mountain regions. Additionally, indoor environment health is compromised as cement-based buildings trap heat, restrict breathability, increase moisture retention, and create poorly ventilated interiors, conditions that exacerbate mold growth, respiratory discomfort, and severe overheating in high-altitude terrains. The cement monoculture emerges because Pakistan's construction industry offers little innovation in alternative materials. University curricula, the academia needs to do more. It prioritizes concrete over the tacit intelligence of local forms. Labor is trained for shuttering and RCC rather than adaptive site-sensitive practices. And planning codes designed for flat lands are applied uncritically to steep slopes. The result is a homogenized built landscape that ignores hydrology, soil behavior, and thermal needs. Architecture in this frame ceases to respond, instead overrides, imposing rigid templates on a terrain that demands adaptation. At Largeworth, which is the organization I'm representing, we began with a simple question: how do forms emerge in mountain landscapes? And to answer this, I developed a multi-scalar mapping method inspired by Christopher Alexander's pattern language, which contains rules for how human beings interact with built forms. The pattern language is a set of tried and tested or inherited solutions that optimize how built environment promotes human life and a sense of well-being. Social patterns translate to architectural patterns, part anthropology, part ecology, part architectural analysis. We read the landscape in 3 nested scales. At the macro level, we analyze the valley as living hydrological and geological system. We trace glacial histories, water flows, shadow lines, seasonal winds, solar exposure, and geomorphology that structures possibility. What emerged was not context, but a metabolic reading of the terrain. How settlements fold and slope, how circulation flows water, and how risk and resource co-produce space. At the meso level, we read the landscape as a socio-ecological organism. Here, patterns become visible as rhythmic practices, the alignment of verandas with agricultural calendars, the clustering of houses around kinship obligations, and the spring and autumn repair cycles that regulate architectural maintenance. These patterns reveal architecture not as a built outcome, but as a temporally distributed practice, bringing together labor, care, and seasonality. At the micro level, materials and construction practices encode environmental intelligence. Soil samples, plaster recipes, timber joinery all operate as material logics, not aesthetic artifacts. Even small climatic shifts like a longer monsoon or a quicker freeze can destabilize these logics. Many failures we see today are not because traditional methods are outdated, but because the climatic baselines that supported them have shifted. Across these scales, patterns allowed us to map what holds, what collapses under new pressures, and what needs to be adapted. Importantly, our methodology showed that failure is often systemic and not material. A soil block doesn't fail because it is weak, it fails because drainage is blocked at an upstream road cut. A traditional roof doesn't leak because the craft is obsolete, it leaks when the freeze-thaw cycles accelerate beyond what the original was designed for. Plasters don't fail because mud is unreliable. They fail when shifting precipitation patterns or redirected runoff repeatedly saturate surfaces that were once calibrated to a very different climate regime. This multiscalar diagnosis fed directly into the mountain architecture guidelines for sustainable tourism development. The guidelines are not a catalog of vernacular forms, I must say. They are a translation of the relational intelligences that allow buildings to perform in fragile ecologies. They translate patterns into design constraints, construction principles, and maintenance rhythms that planners and communities can use without flattening the context or the complexity of the landscape. This year, for the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government, we carried out a province-wide survey on vernacular mountain architecture. to strategize how mountain architecture guidelines can be implemented for habitat planning. The results confirmed what our method made visible. Vernacular systems don't persist simply because they belong to a tradition, they persist because they work. They are climatically, materially, and ecologically calibrated to their landscapes. An overwhelming 92% of vernacular buildings identified are still in daily use, and more than 80% are over 40 years old. Their longevity is not accidental. These structures have endured decades of seismic activity, snow loads, fluctuating temperatures, indicating that their material and spatial logics remain well suited to the mountain environment. These buildings are still functioning precisely because they sit inside the relational patterns that concrete structures routinely violate. A telling example is Kailash Valley, where we spent 2 years working with the Department of Culture, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and the local communities to co-develop building bylaws for the protection of the built heritage of Kailash Valley. These regulations were carefully designed to align with both the cultural practices and the physical environment, ensuring that new construction would respect the valley's fragile mountain environment and the built heritage. Yet, after 2 years of intensive collaboration and sensitization, a government building, a police station, appeared at the valley entrance constructed in reinforced concrete, violating nearly every principles of the very bylaws we had helped draft. The problem was not the building, it was the rupture of relational patterning. Our method helped us articulate this is not an aesthetic issue, but an ecological and interscalar breakdown. The pattern language approach then resituates architecture within systems and not styles. It allowed us to translate ecological intelligence into planning tools while still honoring the distributed knowledges that sustain mountain life. And it pushed us to see that climate resilience in fragile ecologies is not a technological add-on. It is a coherence of relations between materials, labor, landform, and season. At the Community Conservation Lab, which we've set up in Gilgit-Baltistan, our interventions follow the relational logic revealed by our pattern language work. If the landscape is a system of interdependent patterns, architectural practice must also be patterned, incremental, and relational. When we work with owners of heritage houses in the north, the goal is not to preserve tradition, but to activate the ecological logics embedded within these buildings. Mud plasters made from local soils, fibers, and admixtures are not aesthetic choices. They are integral to the thermal regulation and hydrological management honed over centuries. Restoration workshops become active laboratories where ustads and young masons observe how materials responding to shifting climates, testing and adjusting recipes and ratios in real time. And you can see a material palette here. We've been testing some plasters in the summer with local craft people. Knowledge is not simply recovered here, it is resituated within the networks of material, labor, and ecological relations that sustain mountain life. Through our annual Large Earth Visiting School, which is an interdisciplinary and cross-curricular program bringing together local communities and students of architecture, environment, art, and economics, they engage with the pattern language mapping, reading human settlements as a system of relationships rather than isolated objects. So together with the communities, students do not study vernacular architecture per se, they study ecological patterning through spatial analysis. They map hydrology, test soils, trace winter circulation inside homes, and observe how agricultural labor shapes spatial form. The intention is to cultivate a relational approach, the capacity to see a building, not a style, but relational system embedded in climatic, material, and cultural networks. And for many students, this becomes a reorientation of our architectural thinking itself. The relational method continues into our engagement with the government, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa government and GB. The mountain architecture guidelines or the building codes for the protection of Kailash Valley do not reproduce vernacular forms, they translate pattern insights into policy language. Slope logic, water logic, passive thermal principles, relational siting, and will it scale drainage along with seasonal maintenance rhythms? And our soil block studies emerge from the same ethos, understanding material performance not as a technical variable, but as a situated ecological behavior, highlighting the need for policy that intensifies low carbon, climate responsive construction rather than enforcing imported monocultural building forms. Let me close with a few propositions which are more as trajectories that emerge from our work, and we're still sort of following these. To resituate architecture within ecological relations and not object categories. So buildings derive performance from systems they inhabit. Any future-facing architecture must begin by reading and restoring those relations. Number 2, treat mountain fragility as a relational condition, not a disaster profile. Fragility is not an occasional risk, it is an ongoing condition shaped by slope, climate variability, and accessibility. So policies should embed this understanding into planning, zoning, and building regulations, acknowledging that resilience is ecological and is systemic and not just reactive. The third is reorient architectural education towards relational systems. If we want climate responsive, culturally grounded architecture, we must train students to read patterns across soil, season, labor, material behavior, and to design systems that cohere across multiple relations. And the last one, interventions must operate simultaneously across scales, from material experiments and household level repairs to settlement patterns and provincial policy. Treating the building as an isolated unit reproduces the very fractures that we're trying to address. A genuinely multi-scalar, multi-actor approach is necessary to ensure that architectural practice remains ecologically situated and culturally accountable. Across these fronts, our commitment at Largeworth remains the same. Architecture is not the fabrication of forms, but the ongoing negotiation of relations. What holds a building together in fragile ecologies is not its geometry or material inventory, but the dense mesh of hydrological pulses, labor rhythms, soil behaviors, seasonal contingencies, and social obligations that co-produce it. In this sense, architecture is less an object than a practice of attunement, a way of staying with the agencies, human and more than human, that make habitation possible. Climate resilience then cannot be engineered as an external solution delivered to a landscape. It must emerge from within the patterning of that landscape, from the interdependencies that already reorganize life and matter. In volatile mountain ecologies, resilience is not a technical attribute but a relational condition, a continual recalibration among water, slope, material, temperature, craft, and community. It is patterned, not imposed, enacted, not installed. And only by working through these entangled relations can architecture participate in futures that remain livable. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. I would now like to invite His Excellency Tariq Ali Khan, High Commissioner of Canada to Pakistan, to share his reflection. Could we please have a round of applause, please?
Well, those were some very hard acts to follow. So I have my friend Dr. Bhutta to thank for putting me after these brilliant presentations. But let me first, can we have a round of applause for those last three presentations? They were just amazing. Assalamu alaikum. It's so great to see all of you here today. I want to just say a couple of words about our relationship between Canada and the Aga Khan institutions that are supporting this event, because it's a special relationship. It's a relationship that goes back decades. It goes back to supporting the AKU here and its School of Nursing, and being one of the first supporters to the Aga Khan Rural Support Program, which operated in, of course, northern Pakistan and continues to do so. And I'm going to offer you some reflections based a little bit on my experience up north as well. I think, just sort of in what we've heard from the speakers, there are a number of dimensions that are really worth reflecting on as we look at the cases and those amazing images we saw of solutions that are at the micro level, at the household level, at the community level, and then of course the broader systemic and structural things that need to change if we want to see more climate adaptive and climate resilient communities. One of them, and I would just say, is the importance of the policy creation at the macro level. Hearing from the minister, of course, himself, lay out what is Pakistan's plan for addressing some of these things related to climate-smart agriculture, community resilience, even things like e-government. These things are all part of the mix of what helps communities adapt. But as we all know, policy design requires the implementation capacity. And so other orders of government are really, really critical. And I think about that when I think about just thinking of the case studies related to Karachi, as well as the smaller communities in the north that we saw on the screen. What else is in this interdisciplinary mix? Energy. Energy shortage, the need for energy generation and transmission. I'm really struck by that as a challenge facing Pakistan right now. There's, of course, all of the demand for clean energy. As Canada, we're really happy to be supporting a Canadian company, which is the largest clean energy provider in Pakistan. It's called JCM Power. It operates in Sindh. It does solar power generation, and then it's going to go to a combination of solar and wind. But what everyone tells me in coming back to Pakistan after many years is that it's not just about generation, it's actually about transmission lines, and these are a really key element in the architecture mix. So glad to hear us talking about architecture being more about a rigid built environment and more about things that are relational, because so many of the things that touch those relationships are about energy and about negotiation. The importance of security and rule of law in so many of the areas and instances that we're talking about, and the challenges we're being faced with. It is sometimes about an absence of adherence to norms that are in place, and the real challenges faced by rule of law in places where governance is weak. And you can think about that from whether that's urban or rural, but it really is crucial to factor into the mix when we look at these at the interplay. Migration. Communities aren't static, as we know, whether they're urban or rural. They don't just contain traditional landholders who have traditional relationships. They also contain newcomers. They contain people who have settled and are regarded as outsiders, as others, as illegals. But they're also residents, and they're in that built environment, and they're influencing that built environment, and the built environment is, of course, influencing them. I'm in lots of conversations, of course, with government and with UN agencies about just Pakistan managing its migrant challenges, refugee challenges. But those aren't just national in scale. They are also very, very local challenges and community challenges, as we all know. And Karachi is a great example of that. On the mitigation side, I was really glad that we started off with that observation from Dr. Bhutta that climate change is exacerbating existing disparities. And I think that's something else that's really, really critical for us to walk away with, is being really honest about what those disparities are, because they really do cut across class and income and gender. In our built spaces and particular communities. It was so interesting to look at the example of the northern areas and your images on the screen. I did my master's research in Baltistan about 27 years ago, and I spent probably the coldest winter of my life up there, sleeping in a room where the temperature dropped to minus 17 degrees because it was a concrete room with no heat source. And I think the only reason I could weather sleeping in that room every night was because I grew up in probably the coldest city in Canada, which is Winnipeg. So I could actually sort of put up and bear with that kind of cold. But it was just a daily reminder to me of how this architecture did not suit this environment at all. And I think there are some inspiring things that we can turn to at the community level As much as there are, this plethora of hotels in these kind of places that are built without a lot of sustainability principles, there are organizations that are recognizing now up there what traditional architecture means, what it means to restore it. Some of the new hotels are trying to integrate and bring back traditional design, use more sustainable materials like safeda and poplar for the wood structure, clay block, rammed earth, all of these things. I heard people talking about how they want this back. And that leads me to another factor which I think we need to be thinking about in the mix, which is how do we incentivize the private sector to be a player in providing those goods and services at costs that people can afford, so that they can also be reintegrated. And of course, that's a key part of climate finance writ large, is how do we incentivize the private sector to play that kind of positive contribution. So I do want to mention the importance of the private sector. On traditional knowledge, I also thought it was so interesting, the things that you spoke about and all of those great examples that we saw on the screen from across Pakistan. On my last trip up to Baltistan a few weeks ago, I had people talking to me about the traditional science of glacial grafting, which they do in Baltistan and Ladakh. And literally, they are carrying blocks of ice on their backs up to the permafrost, reintegrating them into the permafrost and creating a permanent source of ice-fed water. And this is something they've done for centuries. And it goes back to what you were saying, which is that it is not about managing a crisis or a disaster. It's about understanding that there is an ongoing management of that dynamic, and that communities are used to doing that. Water stupa is also another great example, pumping water literally back up towards the permafrost where it can freeze and form a permanent ice source to feed these communities. So I think there's all of those great examples, and there are people doing so many interesting things. What is really important to do is, I think, in my reflection back to you, is the linkages that we can make between the conversation that happens here and how that conversation happens out in more remote rural areas, or in those Kachiabadis or places in parts of peri-urban Karachi. And that goes back to one of the aspects of your presentations on Karachi, which is the space for civil society. So the space for community consultation, the role of civil society. It's not just about the individual person who is building or innovating, but it's also how do you actually get coalition and community engaged to find those solutions. And Karachi has had actually examples of those in the past, like the Orangi Pilot Project and things like that. That kind of work is an example of, I think, of where people know how to organize. It's a catalyst that needs to kind of come in to help bring some of those innovations into the conversation. So those are just a few examples that I just wanted to kind of reflect on with you. But I would just really want to thank the AKU for having this conversation, because one of my first reactions was, what does global health have to do with architecture and climate change? And I think when we have this interdisciplinary conversation, we realize it has everything to do with health outcomes and addressing health challenges. So thank you so much. Those are a few of my reflections. Shukriya bahut bahut aapka. Thanks.
Thank you, Your Excellency. To close today's inaugural session, I would now like to introduce Dr. Tanya Bubla, Provost and Vice President, Academic, Aga Khan University. Dr. Tanya Bubla was Professor and Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences at the Simon Fraser University from 2017 to 24. Previously, she was a professor in the School of Public Health and adjunct professor in the Alberta School of Business at the University of Alberta, Canada. She's a fellow at the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences and a fellow of the Royal Society, Canada. She holds a PhD in biology from the University of Sydney and a JD from the University of Alberta. She clerked for the Honorable Louis Arbour at the Supreme Court of Canada and was called to the bar in 2005. Her research program in intellectual property and health law focuses on large collaborative science networks in genomics and advanced therapeutics, addressing barriers to the effective translation and clinical adaptation of new technologies. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Tanya Bubla for closing remarks and vote of thanks.
Thank you so much. So first of all, Dr. Buddha, thank you so much for organizing a suite of conferences this week. So we've moved from women leadership and women in science to a conference today on built environments and climate change, community adaptation and resilience. And I'm so thrilled that we had the two keynote speeches today from two eminent women scholars and representatives of civil society. So for you, I think that was the best talk I have heard possibly in the last 2 or 3 years. It was absolutely inspiring, and it was sheer poetry. It was absolutely beautiful, besides the fact that I love that part of the world, so your photographs were spectacular. But just your style of speaking and the way that you wove your narrative about architecture and built environments into the descriptive ecologies of the mountains just really, really spoke to my heart. So thank you so much for that. On our talk, I think that the common thread for me that ran through the talks was the need for grassroots participation, that these solutions are not going to come with heavy-handed top-down government approaches, that governments need to engage with local solutions and with the people that they are supposedly serving. Your first talk, the first keynote, reminded me of work that I have done through my academic career with Lynn Ostrom. I don't know if you know her. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in economics. And I had the privilege of being part of a working group with her looking at health systems as commons. So the reason that she won the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics was because she researched a variety of different common pool resources and common pool structures. So she started with her PhD looking at community policing. And then she moved on to agrarian contexts around the world, looking at why is it that Hardy's conceptualization of the tragedy of the commons does not eventuate when you have strong community structures that are grounded within their ecologies. And the reason for that is because of fundamentally a set of rules and governance principles that come from the community themselves. So they don't overutilize common spaces, whether those are fisheries, whether those are the water systems that you were showing, and other or forest networks, because there's community-based rules, there's an understanding of those rules, and there are graduated sanctions that are community enforced to ensure that there is equitable distribution of the bounties of the community's resources. And so I think these are lessons that we need to take into the future if we are going to make any progress in climate solutions and particularly in built environments. Now, what makes that more difficult in Karachi? I think it is the fact that we don't necessarily have communities, right? When you have when there's a homogeneity where the built environment supports a culture of connection, where people know their neighbors, where there is an understanding that if you take more than your fair share, there will be social shunning, where you have the social structures in place. These are environments where you can govern. Where you have a hodgepodge of entities that are in competition, where you set up that competition for scarce resources, that's where things become much more difficult to manage. And so you were talking about, migrations and other things. So I think these are all of the contexts in which we need to come up with solutions. Now, the low-cost solutions are, I think, our colleagues from UCL who spoke. I had some questions. The low-cost solutions seem low-cost and applicable and scientifically validated in terms of the measurements. But the problem is that those who bear the cost or the burden of the impacts of climate change are not those that are going to contribute to the underlying wealth to contribute to the solutions. Those who hold the wealth, who hold the power, do not suffer or feel the same impact of the climate environment. And so for them, the concept of, or the notion of investing $1 billion in roofing solutions for poor communities, this is a power question. Do I spend it on a new fighter jet, or do I spend it on climate solutions for Karachi? But they don't have that connection, that essence to the vulnerable communities that are impacted. So again, I think in all of our thinking through solutions, and this is what came from the talks, was we have to think about embedded power and power structures and the need for community engagement, civic society, and empowered governance for climate solutions. So it's just been a really inspiring evening, and I thank you very much, and thank you for putting me on the spot. But enjoy your evenings and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bubla. We will now present tokens of appreciation to our keynote speakers. Dr. Butta is already here, as is Dr. Bubla. Could I please request His Excellency Tariq Khan to take the stage for the presentation ceremony? May I please invite Professor Sajida Heather Vandal to come up on stage. Thank you, Professor Vandal. Thank you, Professor Vandal. May I request Christopher Berman and Joseph Augustine to come up on stage? Unfortunately, they're not here. They're busy giving an interview. May I please invite Dr. Zara Hussain to the stage? Thank you, Dr. Zara. Finally, may I request the Provost and Vice President, Academic AKU, Tanya Bupla, who's already here, and Dr. Zulfikar to present His Excellency Tariq Ali Khan with his token of appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the inaugural day of the IGHD Annual Conference 2025. Dinner is now served outside the auditorium. We look forward to welcoming you again tomorrow for day 2, which starts at 9 a.m. sharp. Sharp. Thank you and good evening.